The diner was exactly the kind of place Evelyn Carter liked. Quiet, small, and filled with people who knew her name. She had been coming here for years, ever since she retired to this town, a place far removed from the chaos of war. The bell over the door jingled as she stepped inside, her cane tapping against the worn linoleum floor, her movements slow but steady. She wasn't as strong as she used to be, not after 90 years of battles, both on the field and in life, but she still carried herself like a soldier, back straight, eyes sharp, always aware. "Evening, Evelyn," the owner, Joe, greeted her from behind the counter. "Evening, Joe," she replied with a small nod. She made her way to her usual booth near the window, where she could see everything and everyone. She ordered the same thing she always did, a cup of coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie. It was a quiet night, just the way she liked it. A few regulars were scattered around, sipping coffee, lost in their own worlds. Then the bikers arrived. The rumble of their motorcycles shattered the peaceful evening, a deep growling noise that made the old windows vibrate. 5 of them, their bikes lined up outside like a pack of wolves marking their territory. The diner grew tense the moment they stepped in. Leather jackets, greasy hair, a confidence that came from thinking they owned whatever room they walked into. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had seen worse men in worse places. They strutted inside, laughing loudly, shoving each other as they made their way to the counter. They were young, mid-20s, full of cocky energy. They didn't order, they demanded. One of them, a tall guy with a scar across his cheek, reached over and grabbed a plate from another customer's table, eating the food like it was his. Joe tensed behind the counter but didn't say anything. Evelyn set her coffee cup down and watched. A waitress barely out of high school tried to approach them. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she held her notepad. Can I take your order?" Scarface smirked, leaned in too close. "What's on the menu, sweetheart?" The other bikers laughed. Evelyn's fingers curled around her cane. The waitress stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. But Scarface wasn't done playing. He reached out and snatched her pen, twirling it between his fingers. "What's wrong, honey? Cat got your tongue?" She swallowed hard, glancing toward Joe, who looked helpless behind the counter. No one moved, no one said anything. The diner had fallen silent, everyone pretending they weren't watching, hoping the bikers would just leave. Evelyn exhaled through her nose. Cowards. She pushed back her chair and stood. The cane hit the floor with a sharp tap, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The bikers turned. Scarface's eyes landed on her, sizing her up, dismissing her instantly. "Mind your business, Grandma," he sneered. Evelyn met his gaze, calm, unreadable. "You dropped something." Scarface frowned. "What?" She pointed at the pen in his hand. "The waitress's pen. You took it." Scarface laughed. "You serious?" The other bikers chuckled. One of them muttered, "Old lady's got balls." Evelyn didn't blink. "I just think it's sad." Scarface's smile faltered. "What's sad?" "That you think being a bully makes you a man," she said simply, her voice steady, controlled. "That taking something that doesn't belong to you makes you powerful." She tilted her head slightly. "Where I come from, men who acted like that didn't last long." Scarface's smirk faded completely. The tension in the diner shifted. The other bikers stopped laughing. Scarface's eyes darkened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by an old woman. "You got a real smart mouth, lady," he said, taking a step closer. The waitress took a step back. Evelyn didn't move. Scarface reached out and knocked her cane aside, sending it clattering to the floor. "Now what?" he taunted. "Gonna call the cops?" Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she pulled out her flip phone from her pocket. She dialed a number. Scarface laughed. "Oh, this is Rich. Who the hell are you calling, Grandma?" Evelyn didn't answer. She simply pressed the phone to her ear and spoke 3 words. "I need backup." Then she closed the phone and set it on the table. The bikers exchanged nervous glances. Scarface scoffed. "Oh yeah? And who the hell is coming?" Evelyn picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and smirked. "You'll see." The first headlights appeared outside, then another and another. Engines rumbled, deep and heavy, rolling in one by one, until the entire diner was bathed in the glow of approaching vehicles. The bikers froze. Scarface turned toward the window, eyes widening as black SUVs and motorcycles pulled up in front of the diner, blocking the road. The door swung open. The first man who walked in was massive, his frame broad and solid, his beard streaked with gray. His jacket bore a simple insignia, a Special Forces patch. Behind him, more men entered, older, harder, weathered by time, but still dangerous as hell. A group of military veterans. Evelyn picked up her phone again, flipping it open. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm, casual, like she had just invited old friends for coffee. "We've got a problem here." The leader of the group looked at her, then at the bikers. Scarface swallowed hard. Evelyn smirked, setting her coffee down. "Now, let's see how tough you really are." Scarface's cocky smirk had disappeared, replaced by something cold and uncertain. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, eyes darting between Evelyn and the men, now standing at the entrance of the diner. The door swung shut behind them with a soft click, but the sound might as well have been a gunshot. The air in the room had shifted, thick with something unspoken. Evelyn leaned back in her booth, folding her hands neatly over the table. She didn't have to say a word. The message had already been delivered. The man in front of the veterans was built like a tank, his frame thick with muscle, even at his age. His beard was streaked with gray, but there was nothing soft about his face, a face that had seen war, blood, and men like these bikers before. His name was Frank Holloway, a retired Green Beret and longtime friend of Evelyn's, and he wasn't smiling. One of the younger bikers shifted uneasily, his bravado cracking as he took in the group of men now standing between them and the exit. These weren't just old men, these were soldiers, warriors, the kind of men who had fought real battles and walked away. Scarface forced a grin, trying to regain control. "Oh, I see how it is," he said, his voice a little less steady than before. "Grandma needed her boyfriends to come bail her out." Frank took one slow step forward, boots heavy against the tile floor. He didn't break eye contact. "You got about 10 seconds to apologize to the lady," he said, voice low and even, "before we make you regret ever walking in here." Scarface let out a nervous chuckle, but nobody laughed with him. Evelyn picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and sighed. "Frank, I told you I could handle myself." Frank shrugged, his eyes never leaving Scarface. "I know, but I figured I'd save you the trouble of getting blood on your hands." Scarface's jaw clenched, and for a second, it looked like he might do something stupid. His ego was fighting for its life, trying to hold on to the illusion of control. He flicked a glance at his crew, trying to gauge if they still had his back. They didn't. One of them, the youngest, maybe barely out of his 20s, was already taking a step away, his hands slightly raised. Another one wouldn't meet Scarface's eyes. They were outnumbered and outclassed, and now they knew it. Scarface squared his shoulders. "You don't scare me, old man." Frank's expression didn't change. "Good." And then he moved, faster than anyone in that diner expected. 1 second, Frank was standing still, as stone. The next, he had closed the distance between them, his hand gripping the front of Scarface's jacket, lifting him clear off his feet and slamming him into the counter with a force that rattled the entire diner. Dishes clattered. The waitress let out a startled yelp. Scarface let out a strangled gasp, his body going rigid. Evelyn sighed. "Told you." Frank leaned in, his face inches from Scarface's. "I fought in wars before your daddy ever bought his first bike. I buried men harder than you before you were even born." His grip tightened, the leather of Scarface's jacket creaking under the pressure. "And right now, I'm trying real hard to let you walk out of here." Scarface's face was red, veins bulging in his neck. He tried to shove Frank off, but the older man didn't budge. Another veteran, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward. His voice was calm, steady. "Apologize or don't. Either way, you're leaving." Scarface's eyes darted toward his crew, searching for backup that wasn't coming. Finally, his lips curled back. "Fine." His voice was strained, bitter. "I'm sorry." Frank held him there for a second longer, letting the weight of it settle. Then, just as quickly as he'd grabbed him, he let go. Scarface stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the counter. Evelyn took another slow sip of coffee. "See? That wasn't so hard." Scarface's chest heaved as he straightened his jacket, humiliation and rage flashing across his face. but he knew he had lost. He turned on his heel, shoving past his crew toward the exit. His men followed without question, filing out of the diner one by one. Frank and the other veterans watched them go. They weren't worried about retaliation. Men like that? They didn't come back once they realized they weren't the biggest wolves in the room. The bell over the door jingled again as the last of them disappeared into the night. Silence hung over the diner. The waitress still looked shaken. The other patrons stayed frozen in place, as if waiting for something else to happen. Evelyn finally set her coffee cup down and looked at Frank. "You gonna stand there all night, or are you gonna sit and have some pie?" Frank grinned, shaking his head. "Hell, if I'd known I was coming to rescue you, I would have brought my appetite." One of the other veterans chuckled. She didn't need rescuing. Frank slid into the booth across from Evelyn. "Yeah, I figured that out real fast." Joe, the diner owner, finally let out a breath and rubbed his hands over his face. "Jesus, Evelyn, you've got a whole damn army at your beck and call?" Evelyn smirked. "Number just friends." Joe exhaled. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Evelyn winked. "Smart man." The other veterans sat down at the counter, like this was just another casual night out. The waitress hesitated before coming back over, visibly calmer now. Frank gestured to her. "Bring us some coffee, sweetheart, and a round of pie. The lady here owes us a meal." Evelyn snorted. "Owes you? You all just wanted an excuse to scare the hell out of some punks." Frank shrugged. "Maybe." He grinned. "But it was damn fun." The tension in the diner finally melted away, replaced by quiet laughter, the clinking of plates, and the warm scent of fresh coffee. Outside, the night had returned to its quiet, undisturbed peace. And Evelyn? She took another bite of her pie, feeling completely, utterly content. The young and reckless always thought they ruled the world. But they always forgot one thing. There are some people you don't mess with. And Evelyn Carter was one of them. The night had settled back into its usual rhythm inside the diner, low chatter, the occasional clink of a coffee cup against porcelain, the steady hum of the neon sign flickering outside. The tension from earlier had mostly drained away, replaced by something lighter. But Evelyn Carter knew better. She had lived through too many wars, fought too many battles, some with bullets, others with time, to believe a group of young, arrogant men would just take their bruised egos and leave without a second thought. Frank Holloway sat across from her, casually stirring his coffee, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes sharp as ever. Around them, the other veterans who had answered her call took their seats, some at the counter, others at the booths, filling the room with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Even in their older years, they carried themselves like men who had seen war, survived it, and never quite left it behind. Evelyn took another slow sip of her coffee. "They'll be back," she said, her voice even, calm. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She gave a small nod. "Punks like that, they don't know when they've lost, and now they've got something worse than a bruised ego." She set her cup down, her fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic. "They've got a reason to come back." Joe, the diner owner, overheard and let out a nervous breath. "Damn it, Evelyn, you're saying I gotta deal with those jackasses again?" Frank chuckled, stretching his arms. "Relax, Joe. If they come back, they're in for a hell of a surprise." The waitress, a young woman named Rachel, still looked shaken. She hadn't spoken much since the bikers left, but now she hesitated near the counter. "You really think they'll try something?" Evelyn nodded. "They always do." And she was right, because outside, down the highway just out of view from the diner's windows, the roar of motorcycle engines was already ripping through the night. Scarface's hands shook with rage as he tightened his grip on the throttle, his bike tearing down the road, his crew behind him. His blood was still boiling from the humiliation back at the diner. That old woman, that damn old woman, and those freaking war fossils. He had never felt small before, not in his entire life. He had run with bikers since he was 16, took what he wanted, never backed down. But that old man, Frank was it, had handled him like he was a damn child, like he didn't even matter. Scarface gritted his teeth. Number? He wasn't gonna let that stand. "You sure about this, man?" one of his guys called from behind him, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the engines. Scarface didn't answer, just gunned the throttle harder. They weren't going back to start a fight. They were going back to end one. Inside the diner, Evelyn heard the sound first. The familiar low growl of engines approaching fast. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her coffee, took a slow sip, and exhaled. Frank, across from her, sighed. "Guess you were right." Joe cursed under his breath. "I swear to God, Evelyn, if they break my damn windows." She set down her cup, her fingers brushing over the rim. Then maybe it's time they learned a real lesson. The veterans around the diner didn't move, but their postures shifted. Years of instincts, buried but never forgotten, surfaced in an instant. The old men didn't reach for weapons. They didn't need to. The war was already in them. The bikers rolled up fast, skidding to a halt outside the diner, dust kicking up behind their tires. Scarface was the first off his bike, ripping off his helmet and tossing it to the ground. His heart pounded as he stomped toward the door, his men right behind him. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from anger. This time, he wasn't playing around. This time, he had brought a gun. He pushed through the diner doors hard enough to slam them against the walls, making everyone inside look up. The veterans didn't move. They just stared. Evelyn stayed in her seat, her expression unreadable, calm as ever. Scarface's breath came fast. He wanted to see fear, needed to see it. But all he saw was quiet amusement, and that pissed him off even more. "You think this is funny, Grandma?" he snarled, reaching into his jacket. "You think this is some kinda—" Frank stood up. Scarface stopped mid-sentence. The old man didn't grab a gun. He didn't even ball his fists. He just stared at Scarface like he was already dead. Scarface suddenly felt that same sinking feeling in his gut that he had back at the counter. The other veterans slowly stood as well, one by one, rising from their seats, blocking every exit, every path to escape. Scarface's confidence started cracking, but he held on to his rage. "You think a bunch of old men scare me?" His voice wavered slightly, but he covered it with bravado. Frank exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then he smiled. Scarface's stomach twisted. It wasn't the kind of smile you want to see in a fight. "You really don't get it, do you?" Frank muttered. He took one step forward. "You're not in charge here." Scarface reached for his gun. Before his fingers could even graze the handle, Evelyn's cane shot out, hooking the back of his knee. Scarface collapsed instantly, his body hitting the tile floor hard. The impact rattled his skull, knocking the air from his lungs. Before he could move, Frank was on him. A heavy boot pressed against his chest, pinning him in place. Scarface couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller. The old men loomed over him, and for the first time in his life, he understood what real fear felt like. Frank leaned down, voice calm, measured. "You walk into this diner again. You so much as look at this lady the wrong way, and I will personally make sure you never walk again." Scarface couldn't speak. He couldn't move. His own crew didn't step forward. They just stood there, frozen, watching their leader get torn apart without a single punch being thrown. Frank pressed down a little harder on his chest. "You understand me, son?" Scarface nodded, fast, desperate. Frank stepped back. Scarface scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the door, his legs barely working. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a threat. He just ran, his crew following fast, their boots pounding against the pavement as they scrambled onto their bikes and peeled away into the night. The diner was silent. Then Evelyn picked up her coffee again. "Told you," she said. Frank shook his head. "You are one scary woman, Evelyn Carter." Evelyn smiled, taking another sip. "Damn right I am." Scarface's breath was still ragged as he gunned the throttle, the vibration of his bike barely covering the shaking in his hands. The night air felt colder now, the adrenaline leaving his veins, replaced by something else. Fear. Real fear. The kind he hadn't felt since he was a kid. The diner's neon light shrank in the distance behind him, swallowed by the darkness of the open road. He barely registered the fact that he was running. He wasn't thinking, just reacting, getting as far away as possible. His crew followed behind him in stunned silence, their bikes cutting through the night like ghosts. No one spoke, no one asked questions. They had all felt it back there. They weren't the apex predators tonight. They had walked into something bigger. Scarface clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around the handlebars. The anger burned in his chest, battling with the humiliation. He had never been manhandled like that. Never been forced to feel weak. Not by some old man. not by some old woman. He wasn't going to let this stand. He slowed his bike, the others following suit, the roaring engines dying down to a dull rumble as they pulled onto the shoulder of the road. The desert stretched out around them, empty and silent, the only witnesses to their shame being the stars overhead. One of the younger bikers, Jax, finally broke the silence. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Boss, maybe we just let this one go." Scarface snapped his head toward him, eyes dark with fury. "The hell did you just say?" Jax shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others for support, but finding none. "I mean, those guys back there weren't normal. That wasn't some retiree group. That was something else." Scarface's fists curled, his rage barely contained. "You scared of a bunch of washed-up old men, Jax?" Jax hesitated. "I'm not scared. I just think—" Scarface didn't let him finish. He stepped forward and grabbed Jax by the collar, yanking him close. "You think what? That we just walk away? Let some 80-year-old woman humiliate us?" His voice was a snarl now, his teeth clenched. Jax's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "I think we should be smart about this." Scarface shoved him backward, his lip curling in disgust. "Smart? You want to be smart? Then listen up." He turned to the rest of the crew, his voice low, seething. "We go back. We finish this." Silence. Nobody responded right away. Finally, one of the older bikers, Reaper, shifted in his seat, his deep voice cutting through the night. "Boss, you sure about this? That woman called in serious backup. You saw what they did. They weren't just some old war buddies. Those guys were killers." Scarface ignored the warning. "I don't care who they were. We go back. We burn that place to the ground." Jax's eyes widened. "Jesus, man, that's insane." Scarface's rage boiled over. In one quick motion, he drew his knife and pressed the blade against Jax's throat, making the younger man freeze. "You want to leave?" Scarface whispered, his breath hot against Jax's face. "Then go. But if you ride with me, we settle this tonight." Jax didn't move, his breathing shallow. Scarface held his gaze for a second longer before finally stepping back, spinning the knife in his grip and shoving it back into its sheath. "Good. Then let's ride." And with that, he turned his bike around. Inside the diner, the tension had faded, replaced with something lighter, something familiar. The veterans had settled back into their seats, drinking coffee, swapping war stories like they were back at a campfire instead of a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere. Evelyn sat in her booth, enjoying the last few bites of her pie, while Frank leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. He was relaxed, but Evelyn could tell he was still watching the door, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "They'll be back," she said finally, setting her fork down. Frank let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I know." The rest of the diner had calmed, but the veterans, they were already prepared. Evelyn had spent her whole life surrounded by warriors. She knew the look of men who had switched back into combat mode, even if they didn't talk about it. The quiet focus, the way their hands stayed close to their sides, the way they watched the exits without looking like they were watching. These weren't just old friends. These were soldiers still waiting for their next battle. Frank straightened as the sound of engines roared back into the night, growing louder, closer. Evelyn didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply picked up her coffee and took another slow sip. Frank's jaw tightened. Damn fools really don't know when to quit. Headlights flashed through the window as the bikers rolled back in, their engines growling like predators returning to finish a wounded kill. Scarface was the first one off his bike, his stance different now, his hand resting on his waistband. Evelyn caught the motion and exhaled slowly. "They brought guns this time." Frank sighed. "Well, that's just dumb." The door swung open hard, hitting the wall. Scarface stepped in first, his chest rising and falling like a man barely holding back his rage. "Last chance, Grandma," he said, his voice dark, lethal. "You walk out of here, and we let you live." Evelyn let the words settle before tilting her head slightly. "You know," she mused, "I've heard that line before." Scarface scowled. "Yeah? And what happened to the last guy who said it?" Evelyn smirked. "He didn't walk out." Scarface snarled, reaching for his gun. Frank moved before he could even touch it. The old soldier closed the distance in a blur, grabbing Scarface by the wrist and twisting hard. The gun was out of his hand before he even realized what was happening. Scarface let out a grunt of pain as Frank slammed his fist into his ribs, dropping him like a sack of bricks. The other bikers hesitated, but only for a second. Then chaos erupted. The first one to lunge caught an elbow to the throat from one of the other veterans, dropping instantly. Another tried to swing a bat, but a well-placed boot to the knee sent him crashing to the ground with a scream. One of the bikers pulled a blade, but Evelyn was already on her feet, her cane whipping through the air with bone-cracking force, knocking it clean out of his hand. The fight was over before it even started. Scarface gasped on the floor, holding his ribs, his confidence shattered. Evelyn crouched down, tapping him on the forehead with her cane. "This is your last warning," she said, her voice calm, absolute. "Get on your bike, leave, and don't you ever come back." Scarface's lips trembled. He didn't argue. He crawled out of the diner, dragging himself onto his bike, his crew scrambling to follow. Engines roared, and just like that, they were gone for good. Frank sat back down, grabbing his coffee. "Damn, I love small towns." Evelyn smiled, lifting her cup. "Me too." And just like that, the diner went back to normal. The night had swallowed the roar of the engines, leaving only the familiar hum of the diner's neon sign flickering against the glass. The dust left behind by the bikers' hasty exit had already begun to settle, just like the nerves of the few remaining patrons inside. The chaos had passed, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Evelyn Carter leaned back in her seat, tapping her fingers against the rim of her coffee cup. The fight was over, but her mind was still sharp, still focused. Old instincts reminding her to scan, assess, and prepare for what came next. Frank Holloway sat across from her, rubbing his knuckles absently. He wasn't smiling, not yet. He wasn't convinced it was truly over. "You think they're dumb enough to come back?" he finally asked. Evelyn shook her head. "Number? Not after tonight." Frank exhaled, stretching his arms before reaching for his coffee. Good. Was getting real tired of looking at that punk's face. A chuckle rippled through the group of old veterans still gathered around the diner, their laughter low and knowing. They had seen men like Scarface before, loud, arrogant, all bark until they ran into something bigger than them. Rachel, the young waitress who had been caught in the middle of it all, still looked shaken as she refilled coffee mugs. Her hands had stopped shaking, but Evelyn could see the residual fear in her eyes. She hadn't been in a fight like that before, hadn't seen what real danger looked like. She placed the coffee pot down and hesitated near Evelyn's booth. That was insane," she said softly. Evelyn glanced up, offering a small nod. "Yeah, but it's over now." Rachel let out a shaky breath. How were you so calm?" Evelyn smirked, stirring her coffee. "You live long enough, you realize most fights aren't about who's the toughest. It's about who's willing to stand their ground." She took a slow sip, savoring the warmth. "And trust me, kid, I've stood my ground against a hell of a lot worse." Rachel managed a nervous laugh, but Evelyn could tell the weight of it all was still pressing down on her. "Listen," Evelyn continued, setting her cup down. "You did good tonight. You kept your head. That's more than most people can say." Rachel bit her lip, nodding slowly. I thought they were gonna hurt someone." "They were," Frank cut in, his voice matter of fact, "until they realized they picked the wrong place." Rachel looked between them, processing everything that had happened. Then she exhaled and smiled. A small, relieved thing, but real. "Thanks," she said, before turning back to her duties. The diner started to return to normal, the hum of quiet conversation filling the air again. The veterans settled in, drinking their coffee, retelling stories of old wars and battles fought long ago. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary night Evelyn had always cherished. But deep down, she knew this one felt different. She glanced toward the window, staring out at the desert beyond, her thoughts drifting. She had fought her wars, both on the battlefield and in life. She had seen things no one should ever see, buried friends, outlived her enemies, and somehow, she was still here. But for how much longer? Frank must have caught something in her expression because his voice softened. "What's on your mind, Carter?" Evelyn smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking how much things change, and how much they stay the same." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't that the truth?" He leaned in slightly. You ever think about slowing down, letting someone else deal with trouble like this? Evelyn smirked. And do what? Take up knitting? Frank let out a low laugh. Hey, I hear it's relaxing. Evelyn just shook her head, looking down at her hands. Hands that had held rifles, carried wounded soldiers, written letters to families that never got their loved ones back. You ever feel like we're just waiting? She asked after a moment. Frank's smile faded. Waiting for what? Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him. For the war to end. Frank exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Hell, Carter. If you haven't figured it out by now, it never does. She nodded, already knowing the answer before she asked the question. War wasn't just fought with bullets. It was fought with time, with memory, with the weight of everything you carried with you long after the battlefield was gone. The fight tonight had just been another battle, a different kind of enemy, a different kind of war. But at the end of the day, the result was the same. She had survived. She always did. Rachel came by again, dropping off the check. Evelyn reached for her wallet, but Frank snatched the bill before she could grab it. My treat, he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You getting soft on me, Holloway? Frank smirked. Not a chance. She let him pay. The group started to thin out after that, veterans heading home, shaking hands, sharing one last knowing look before stepping out into the cool night air. The world kept turning, just like it always did. Evelyn stepped outside, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. She breathed in the desert air, crisp and clean, unchanged even after everything that had happened tonight. Frank followed her out, standing beside her. The neon sign flickered above them, casting long shadows across the lot. You good? He asked. Evelyn nodded. Yeah. Frank studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right then. She glanced up at him. You leaving town soon? He exhaled, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. Not yet. Might stick around for a bit. Keep an eye on things. Evelyn smirked. Making sure I don't get into trouble again? Frank chuckled. Something like that. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had been through hell together and knew there wasn't a need for extra words. Evelyn finally turned toward her car, her old bones aching just a little more than usual tonight. See you around, Holloway, she said. Frank nodded. See you around, Carter. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and pulled onto the empty road. The town lights faded in her rearview mirror, swallowed by the desert. The road stretched ahead, endless, just like it always had been. She had won another fight, but deep down, she knew there would always be another, and when it came, she'd be ready. Because Evelyn Carter never backed down. Not then, not now, not ever. The end. Have a good day.